So what I want to do, picking up those themes, is to look at how some of these themes have played out in the one country where they really have evidently mattered, which is the United Kingdom, which on June the 23rd held a referendum and, as you are all be aware, voted narrowly by 51.9% to 48.1% to leave the European Union. I'm going to deal with this really in three parts. The first is to give some backdrop, both as it were the long-term backdrop in terms of attitudes and identities in the UK, and also some of the social and economic developments of which you have to be aware in order to understand the context within which the referendum was fought. Then, secondly, given the professional interests of many people in this room, I'm going to talk in particular about how the campaign was played out, how some of those themes, how that context was used by the two sides in the campaign in order to put forward their respective cases. I will then come back to the voters and give you some idea of how the voters reacted to the campaign, and to give you some understanding of why, in the end, we ended up with the narrow vote in favour of leave. And then doubtless beyond that, we can pick up some of the wider implications of this in the Q&A. Now, first of all, the question you might be asking yourself above all is, well, why were they so stupid to hold this referendum in the first place? After all, unlike Ireland or unlike Denmark, the United Kingdom hasn't under any constitutional obligation to hold referendums if we want to change our relationship with the European Union. But we did. Well, let me just give you a very, very quick sketch for those of you who don't follow the intimacies of British politics on a day-to-day basis. Basically, from the early 1990s, the Conservative Party, that's the centre-right party in the UK, having been the party that took the United Kingdom into the European Union back in 1973, becomes increasingly Eurosceptic. It begins to start towards the end of the premiership of Mrs. Thatcher, her so-called famous Bruges speech, but then very substantial row and difficulty in the UK Parliament in getting the Maastricht Treaty ratified. And then, of course, in September 1992, what is known in the UK as Black Wednesday, the United Kingdom pound was unable to sustain its parity inside the European exchange rate mechanism, and that certainly thereafter certainly helped to fuel the idea on many inside the Conservative Party that Europe wasn't such a good idea after all. Second crucial development, however, and this is the crucial point of decision. From late 2012 onwards, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which was originally founded in the early 1990s by a lecturer at the London School of Economics called Alan Sked, which had already begun to get 2 or 3% in UK-wide elections, began to become a significant player, began to get serious shares of the vote in elections, local by-elections, local elections, etc. And this began to get the Conservatives worried about the implications for them in particular. So in January 2013, David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, makes his famous Bloomberg speech in which he promises that if the Conservative Party were to win a majority in the election that was scheduled for May 2015, that he would hold an in-out referendum on the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union following a renegotiation of the UK's terms of membership. Now, those of you who really know your British history will, of course, say there's a certain sense of déjà vu about all of this. Because back in 1973, the then opposition Labour Party promised that if it were to win the next general election, it would hold a referendum on the United Kingdom's then very new membership of the European Union following a renegotiation of our terms of membership. Why? Because much as David Cameron faced a split party and indeed as well as an electoral threat, Harold Wilson, the then Labour opposition leader, faced a party that was divided on the subject. And how do divided parties solve difficult questions? By asking the electorate to give them the answer. So, but given that Harold Wilson, when he pulled off the trick in the referendum that was held in 1975, succeeded in getting a 2-to-1 majority in favour of staying inside the European Union, this seemed a relatively safe bet. Not least because not very many people, probably David Cameron himself included, did not think that this was a promise that was ever going to get called upon to be fulfilled. Remember, at this point, he is in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats are the most pro-European party in the United Kingdom, though all things are relative. And it was certainly not willing to allow this promise to be fulfilled while the coalition was still in place. However, in May 2015, much to David Cameron's surprise, as pretty much everybody else's, he did narrowly win an overall majority, was stuck with his promise, and so started a whole round of negotiation across the capitals of the European Union, leading eventually to an agreement at the European Council held in February 2016, in which there were some things agreed, a certain amount of limitation on the access to welfare for relatively new EU migrants, and also the payment of child benefit to those whose children were actually in Poland rather than inside the United Kingdom, and also a declaration that everybody else might be signed up to political integration, but we all understood that the United Kingdom was not. What did the public think of this? Not much. Actually, if you look at the slightly finer detail, what you discover is that most people said, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, absolutely great. Just not enough. And so therefore, the first thing one needs to realize is that politically, the renegotiation of the UK's terms of membership was a failure. It failed to move the opinion polls, as you will see later on. It was judged by more people in the UK as being a bad deal than being a good deal. And to that extent, at least, this was one aspect of Howard Wilson's trick that fairly rapidly, clearly had not been fulfilled. But let me now stand back a bit and just talk a little bit about some of the longer-term things that you need to understand how we got to even this position in the first place. The first thing that one needs to appreciate is that I would argue that the fundamental failure of the European project inside the United Kingdom is a failure to persuade the vast bulk of the UK population that Europe was part of us as opposed to other. In other words, most people inside the United Kingdom still regard Brussels and Europe as something that's on the other side of the English Channel, of which they are not part. This is data from the British Social Attitudes Survey, which I help regularly to run. We give people all the identities that are associated with the islands of Great Britain and Ireland, and you can choose as many as you want. So you can say you're European and British and Irish and Scottish or whatever if you want, but typically only around 15% of people inside the United Kingdom actually freely acknowledge that they are European, and there is no evidence that that figure has increased over the long run. Equally, if you give people the opportunity to align themselves on a scale from 1 to 7, how European are you? 7 is high, by the way, 1 is low, and as you can see, it's all lopsided to the left-hand side of the diagram. Indeed, if, as the Eurobarometer regularly has done, it gives people the so-called Moreno question, which ranges from I am European and I'm not British, I am more European than I am British, I am more British than European, I am British, go away, I'm not European at all. It is the latter option that by far and away is the most popular. Typically, around 2/3 of people in the UK say, I am British and I deny that I am European. And again, as you can see, there is little evidence that that pattern has changed during the course of the UK's membership of the European Union. Indeed, also note, and again, this is some of the evidence during the campaign, when you actually ask people, do you agree or disagree that being part of the European Union threatens Britain's distinctive sense of identity? You will see, and this is a couple of different academic surveys, they come up with the same result, around a half of the UK population, this is during the 12 months in the lead up to the referendum, said, yes, I agree. And only around 1/3 actually disagree. So very clear demonstration that Europe is regarded as other and potentially as a cultural threat, not as part of us. Now, second thing one needs to appreciate is that, perhaps unsurprisingly against that backdrop, attitudes towards the European Union in the UK have been extremely volatile during the course of the last 40 years or so. This is data from Ipsos Mori that goes pretty much back to the early 1970s. As you can see, for much of the 1980s, not long after the 1975 referendum, very clear majority of people in favour of leaving. That's the green line. Then we get the period in the late 80s and the early 1990s when actually the European Union is relatively popular. This is the period immediately after the gentleman after whom this building is named, Jacques Delors, went to the Trade Union Conference and the Labour Party Conference and persuaded the Labour movement in the UK, which was hitherto opposed to European Union membership, that actually the European Union was a rather good idea, because after all, you've got that nasty right-wing government run by Margaret Thatcher in London, so you ain't going to get much out of her. We, in comparison, are relatively nice and can provide you with a certain amount of social protection via EU legislation. But in telling you that story itself, I'm beginning to remind you how transactional the UK's relationship with the European Union always has been. We'll put up with it for so long as it's in our interest, but it's a transactional relationship, not one on the basis of a common sense of identity or a common sense of purpose. And then you can see it narrows again during the mid-1990s. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, as the Conservative Party becomes more Eurosceptic. We then remain again in this period of pretty volatile. You can see the early period of the coalition, 2010 to 2012, when UKIP were beginning to rise, we become sceptical again. Actually, in promising the referendum, David Cameron helped to make the EU rather more popular. We can, however, perhaps really get a better flavour of UK attitudes towards the European Union by asking a rather more subtle question. These are the responses to a question where people are given option number one is leave the European Union. Option number two is, well, I suppose we ought to be in the institution. Somebody tells me it's good for us, but it would really be nice if Brussels bossed us around a little bit less. That's the 43%. 90% happy with it as it is, and only 11% actually want a more powerful union. So you need to realize, why is David Cameron trying to sing this song of, look, I'm going to make our relationship with the European Union even more semi-detached than it already is, and then I might ask you to vote for it? Well, because that, in a sense, is the position of the modal UK voter. As you can also see, that perception, and here I'm bringing together for you those people who say they want to leave and those people who say, well, okay, perhaps we should remain, but it should be less powerful. Putting those two groups together, charting them over time. And again, you can see from around the mid-1990s onwards, the United Kingdom becomes much more sceptical. This is in part to do with the Conservative Party becoming much more sceptical. But if you want to understand particularly that sharp increase from 37% in 1995 to 58% in 1996, there is another oft-forgotten event which I think actually proves to be quite important, and that is the decision of the European Union to ban the export of British beef in the wake of the concerns about the transmission of Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. Now think about it, banning one of the iconic foods of a relatively sceptical country from export is a pretty good way of making people feeling rather unhappy about you. Now, the reasons for doing it are obvious, but the political consequences have perhaps long since lived with it. And if you want to note that indeed feeling lack of European identity helps to fuel this sense of Euroscepticism, here is the evidence. This is the people arraigned on that 1 to 7 European scale. The less European you feel, the more Eurosceptic you feel. That probably doesn't surprise you. Now, two more things about the backdrop. Two things that really mark this referendum out from the referendum back in 1975. The first, of course, is the experience of the United Kingdom with respect to immigration during the course of the last 20 years or so. You have to remember that for most of the 20th century, the United Kingdom was a net exporter of population. Even the considerable new Commonwealth immigration in the 1960s did not change that broad picture. And by the way, note parenthetically, in 1948, the United Kingdom gave freedom of movement to all citizens of the British Empire. And when they started to come in the 1960s, it rescinded that decision in 1962 and 1968. This is a story being played out literally for the second time around. But in any event, as you can see, in the late 1990s, partly as a result of changes to immigration law and a rise in asylum applications under the new Labour government, immigration had already started to rise. But then net migration rose even more in 2004. What happened in 2004? Well, of course, this is another part of the irony of this story, is that in a rather unusual rush of Europhilia, the United Kingdom, together with Ireland and Sweden, were the only countries to not insist that the citizens of the A8 accession countries should have to wait 5 years before they got the freedom of movement rights. We said, fine, we don't expect you to come. And they came, and the Polish plumber is now part of UK culture. But it does therefore mean that actually the United Kingdom has been experiencing relatively high levels of inward migration. More recently, it's been coming from Southern Europe because, of course, what does somebody who is a young professional who speaks English and cannot get a job in Barcelona or in Rome or in Madrid, they're coming to London. The second thing to note, of course, is the economic story. This is something I pinched, which looks at relative economic performance since the financial crash. Now, the crucial line here is that kind of slightly purpley line, which is roughly in the middle. The UK suffered relatively badly from the financial crash, but as you can see, whereas the GDP of places like Greece and Spain and Italy have suffered seriously, and while Germany's been doing a little bit better, actually, and particularly more recently, the UK has been doing relatively well. A crucial difference from 1975. Back in 1975, the argument was, we have to join the European Union because we are the sick man of Europe, whereas in contrast, the 6 original members of the European Union have been experiencing twice the rate of economic growth that the United Kingdom has been enjoying. We're having stop-go economics, etc., etc. So the economic backdrop and the economic argument is much more nuanced and much less clear. Back 40 years previously, Europe is clearly better than us. We need to join the club. Now it's that organization that made a perhaps rather dubious decision to create a single currency, which we had the sense not to join, and which has been causing an awful lot of trouble and no longer seems to be such a brilliant economic model. So you can, again, bearing in mind the transactional nature of our relationship, this is potentially important, and you'll see how this plays out in a moment. Now, against that backdrop, therefore, how was the campaign for? Now, you might be anticipating, well, it's pretty obvious. You're going to have a campaign where on one side, you've got lots of people telling you how wonderful the European Union is, and another lot telling them how terrible it is. Nope. You do indeed have one lot saying how bad it is, but the other lot are saying, well, you know what, actually, it's reasonably good, and, you know, well, we probably just about ought to stick in. Here are some of the key messages that the Remain side used during the campaign. Number one, the result of some Treasury economic modelling is that Brexit would cost £4,300 per household by 2030. To which the reaction was, you mean economists can tell us to that degree of precision the state of the economy in 14 years' time? Hang on, they can't usually get it right for 6 months. Leaving the European Union would mean your shopping costs 220 quid more. Well, thanks to the fall in the pound, that might be one that proves to be right. George Osborne, about 10 days out, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister. If you vote to Brexit, I'm going to have to introduce an emergency budget to plug a 30 billion black hole in the UK's finances. Well, the hole's being burned, but we're just going to live with it. The best of both worlds. Yep, that's right. We'll be inside the European Union, but we're not in Schengen. We're not inside the Eurozone. We're not signed up to the integration project. We're not going to be quite so nice to EU migrants. You again see how even relatively sceptical the Remain message is. And then, of course, the standard argument of those arguing for the status quo, leaving Europe would be a leap in the dark, don't risk it. Hey, it's a risk. But notice it's a relatively negative campaign. It's essentially about not actually we need to remain inside the European Union, because if we stay inside the European Union, this, and this wonderful things will happen. It's, hang on, if you're stupid enough to vote to leave, these are going to be the consequences. And here's one of the posters they used. If you're not aware who these characters are, on the left is Nigel Farage, the leader of UKIP, arguably Britain's most influential politician. And on the right is Boris Johnson, now the Foreign Secretary, but at that stage, the most charismatic member of the Conservative Party, who decided relatively late in the day to lead the Leave campaign, and probably was pretty crucial in so doing. Mr. Farage, of course, is got a saw there cutting off the branch on which they are poised. And the idea again is, look, you know, these guys are being silly. They're actually trying to chop off the foundations upon which our prosperity rests. So I hope you get the flavour. I mean, some people described it. The real choice put between the UK public was between, do you want to be half out or do you want to be wholly out? Nobody was really arguing the case for in. What, in contrast, were the Leave campaign saying? They had a very simple strapline. Vote Leave on June the 23rd and take back control. What do they mean by that? Claim back your sovereignty, claim back control over immigration, claim back control over your borders. All those things that are designed to appeal to people's sense that we are British, we're not European, why can Brussels tell us what to do? Number two, I mean, there was a lot of controversy about this, and I'll happily talk about this in Q&A, but I will just simply tell you this was brilliant. I mean, the Remainers hate it, but this was brilliant. We send the European Union 350 million a week. Let's spend it on the NHS instead. That's the health service inside the UK. Remember, the UK is a net contributor. Why are we spending money to Brussels to spend and tell us what to do and spend it somewhere else? To introduce a points-based immigration system, right, that was to deal with the immigration issue, and also, and again, this is a long feature, standing feature of the debate about Europe and the UK. For some critics of the European Union isn't simply a free trade single market. It's a customs union with external tariff barriers. And they argue that actually it's better to be able to negotiate free trade agreements with a much wider range of people inside the world. And by the way, we reckon we can do it more efficiently in the European Union, of which the recent difficulty in Wallonia over the deal with Canada, they will use as an example, and that therefore we will actually end up having more free trade than at present. Here's the picture that tells the story of the campaign. This is the bus that transported Boris Johnson around the country. The slogan on the left-hand side really got the Remain side really upset. And then you will see, of course, both at the bottom and on the back of the bus, let's take back control. Okay? But very, very simple messages. You know, as compared with £4,030 in 14 years' time. It's 350 million quid now it's costing you. Very simple message, no macroeconomics, just a very simple piece of fiscal arithmetic, albeit perhaps somewhat controversially interpreted, together with a very simple strapline. Okay, so let's give you some flavour of how the campaign was fought. How did the public react? Well, I've already said to you, this is crucially a transactional bargain. Therefore, we have to look to see what did people think the consequences of leaving the European Union would be. And I'm going to show you two of many examples, all of which tell you the same story. Here's Exhibit 1 from our internet panel study I was involved in. Now, the first thing to say is, it is true that more people inside the United Kingdom felt that we would be worse off if we left economically than thought we would be better off. 40% on this measure worse off, 30% better off. Equally also, Britain's influence in the world, net terms negative. Will leaving mean we can have a control, make our own laws? Yeah, we can now make our own laws, thanks very much. And will it reduce immigration? Yep, 2/3 of people reckoned it would reduce immigration. Now, I immediately want you to notice that more people felt that immigration would fall if we left the European Union than felt we would be economically worse off than if we left the European Union. So the Remain message has traction, but it doesn't have as much traction, apparently, than the message on the Leave side. Here's exhibit number 2. It's got rather more detail, but it tells you the same story. This is from YouGov's polling shortly before the referendum. Actually, on many issues, the economy, jobs, people's own personal well-being, Britain's influence in the world, more people felt that leaving was going to be bad for us than thought would be good for us. Terrorism, which there was some attempt to use in the wake of unfortunate events both in the city and in Paris, actually didn't work for the Remain side in the way that they thought it would. And again, you'll notice one, will the NHS be better? Yep. But the big one is immigration. Then, of course, however, what you need to be able to do is to ally these perceptions to your campaign. So what happens to that? So which campaign do people actually identify as being offering the better message on these various issues? Well, here again, you begin to see why Remain have a degree of trouble. Yes, the Remain side is thought to be a little bit more strong, more slightly likely to be stronger on the economy and on influence in the world and on jobs, but they are relatively small leads. Taking back control and immigration, there is a large lead for the Leave campaign. So Leave is very, very clearly associated with a couple of themes. The Remain side is only weakly associated with its themes. And indeed, this pattern tended, not dramatically, but to some degree, get worse for the Remain side during the campaign. This again is data from the same polling source. So as you can see from the green lines on immigration, even as the campaign proceeded from mid-April to mid-June, slightly more people said, actually, yes, the Leave campaign has got the right message on immigration, and somewhat fewer people, that's the blue line, said the same about Remain. Meanwhile, on the economy, the association of the Remain side with having the stronger message weakens somewhat, and the Leave campaign at least holds its own. So during the campaign, which was probably a pretty crucial period, then actually the Remain side's message, its ownership of its issues, already relatively weak, gets to be weaker. But here perhaps is the real crucial reason why the Remain side's message did not resonate in the way that they had anticipated. First of all, look at the right-hand side of this chart. Here's a rare example where an opinion poll said to people, not only what do you think will happen if the UK leaves the European Union, but also what will happen if it stays. Now, as you can see, on immigration, it's pretty simple. If we stay, more people are going to come. If we leave, fewer people are going to come. Problem, solution. On the economy, yes, if we leave, the economy is going to be worse. And if we remain, the economy is going to be worse. Just. But notice how the UK public are not convinced that being inside the European Union is a project that is going to result in the economy being better than it is at the moment. That's pretty serious if you're trying to win a transactional argument in which the economy and the financial consequences are meant to be a crucial part of your campaign. Now, how does this work out? This is a kind of little bit of cephalological arithmetic and a little bit of a paradox. As you can, actually, although the Remain sides, although the economy wasn't as strong an issue for the Remain side, as strong an issue for the Remain side as immigration was for the Leave side in terms of the extent to which people bought into their argument, actually in terms of whether or not people were going to vote Remain or Leave, the economy was actually the crucial #1 issue. So, for example, if you just take the second row, amongst the 46% of people in the YouGov survey just before the referendum, of that 46%, 95% of them saying, I'm going to vote to Remain. So if you thought the economy was going to be worse off, you were virtually guaranteed to be a Remain voter. Conversely, however, of course, if you didn't think the economy was going to be worse off, as long as you thought it wasn't going to make much difference, then you were pretty likely to be a Leave voter. So the two camps are very strongly divided. And what I've then simply done for you is say, well, then, what is 54% times 0.87 and what is 46% times 0.5? That gives you the Leave vote in a very simple piece of arithmetic to which the economic perceptions are pointing to. So the Remain side has the lead on the economy. It's a really crucial issue. But even so, less than half the public are convinced they're going to be worse off. So you're pointing to a result that's going to be close to 50-50. Now, what happens if you do the same thing on immigration? Now, actually on immigration, people's views did not align as strongly with their vote as did their views on the economy. Only 84% of only 75% of those people who thought there would be less immigration if we left the European Union actually voted to leave. So actually, although they had the big lead, it wasn't working as strong an issue for Leave as the economy was working for Remain. But of course, there were more of these people. So 75% of 59 is about as good as 95% of 46. And again, I'd worked through the arithmetic, and again, it points to a 50-50 outcome. What, of course, actually this really means is that actually quite a few people in the UK voted to leave, even though they felt that as a result, immigration would go up. Now, doubtless for some of them, that's because actually they thought more immigration was quite a good idea. But insofar as you now kind of want to understand, well, why is the UK government apparently talking so much about not wanting to accept freedom of movement as it currently is? Well, that's probably because actually the proportion of the population in the UK that is concerned about the freedom of movement provisions is larger than the 52% of people who actually voted to leave. Okay, so far I've talked about the UK public as a single species, undifferentiated. Let me just now relatively briefly introduce you to the demographic divisions, because I think this may also speak to some of the wider themes of this session. This was a referendum which exposed major social divisions inside the UK, and these are social divisions which are evident elsewhere, not only in the European Union, they're also evident in the campaign of Donald Trump inside the United States presidential election. Here, first of all, these are the percentage of people who voted for leave on polling done immediately after the referendum, and all the polling all tells the same story. This is, first of all, the division by age. Young people, relatively small proportion of young people voted to leave. A clear majority of older people voted to leave. In other words, ironically, the generation of people that voted to remain in 1975 was now the generation that voted to leave. So there's a big age difference here. Young people born in the age of the internet, born in the age of Ryanair, EasyJet. Hey, go to Brussels, I can still communicate with what's going on in the UK just as easily as I'm actually in London. A relatively recent phenomenon, etc., etc. These folk, yeah, sure, we're part of an international club. Older folk go, hang on, all these immigrants? This is not the country I was born into. And the older you are, cultural, social change becomes more difficult to accommodate. But here's the second and really big division. It's partly about social class, but it's primarily about education. Graduates think that the European Union is wonderful. People who have very little in the way of educational qualifications think it's awful. Now, let me just tell you a little, I'm going to tell you, I paint a little picture just to give you some idea of what lies behind these figures. What I want you to think of is a 55-year-old hotel porter in Margate. Now, Margate, if you want to know, is kind of one of those many declining seaside towns on the English coast because the Brits have discovered that the sun shines in the Mediterranean and therefore that's where they go for their holidays these days. That's the one bit of Europe we do like, by the way. Now, this 55-year-old hotel porter used to enjoy 11 o'clock having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee with the cleaning staff in the hotel, and they talked about what was on the television last night or what is in the Sun or the Daily Mirror today. So they share a common cultural heritage. And it's a relatively stable, if rather declining environment. And, there aren't any immigrants to be. I mean, nobody's got any sense anybody other from England ever bothers to go to Margate in the first place. But now, think of the picture. Our 55-year hotel porter can no longer share 11s with the cleaning staff because the cleaning staff all come from Poland. So they speak to each other in Polish. Meanwhile, he's not had a pay rise since 2008. And he reckons, by the way, that it'd be very, very easy for the hotel management to replace him with yet somebody else from Eastern Europe if he were to try to get one. So, in other words, we're talking here about two things which are aligned with age and with education. One is the cultural challenge of immigration. For some people, immigration is a cultural challenge. It's long been known that people with less than the way of educational attainment find cultural change more difficult to accommodate. Older people find cultural change more difficult to accommodate. But it's also economic. If you're a young university graduate with a degree in French and economics at the University of East Anglia, and you've just got a job in the city, well, probably quite a few of your colleagues also come from other parts of the European Union, and your boss has just told you that you can have a couple of years in Frankfurt if you fancy it. And you say, great, wonderful, fantastic. In other words, we're talking about a division between some people who regard themselves as losers from the process of globalization, of which the European Union is part, but others find themselves to be winners. So there are differences of real interest and differences of cultural affinity that lies behind this debate. And I think this is where the wider issues arise. The truth is, in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, in the wake of the relatively high flows of migration that globalization is resulting in, at least in some countries, there are now kickbacks amongst sections of our society for whom the project means much less. There's one other division which you might anticipate, well, two others. One is by ethnicity. Yes, those in the United Kingdom who are from a ethnic minority background were much more likely to vote to remain. The anti-immigration message of the Leave campaign, unsurprisingly, was not one that they found congenial. The other division, of course, was geographical. It was Wales and provincial England that voted to leave, in all cases relatively narrowly. London voted to remain. Why? London is full of young university graduates. Ergo, and also has a large ethnic minority population. The two that stand out, and I'm going to just leave this for Q&A, are Scotland and Northern Ireland, where I would just simply say the debate was completely different and the outcome as a result was different, even though these were the two parts of the United Kingdom that were least keen on remaining inside the then common market back in 1975. Okay, to conclude. Truth is, Britain stroke the UK has never taken Europe to its heart. This has been an issue of rational calculation, not one of affective empathy. Support for the European Union membership, therefore, has always been conditional, and thus the character of the campaign. It was all about, hang on, this is the side on which we think your bread is buttered. And even on the leave side, hang on, it costs you money. The economic arguments did move people towards Remain, but many were not sufficiently convinced to deliver the Remain side victory, and they were counterbalanced by quite powerful arguments about immigration and, given the nature of our identity, about sovereignty, which left the merits of the transitional deal hanging in the balance and probably depending on the effectiveness of the campaigning. And I would suggest that the Leave side probably had the better tunes in a ballot that actually, however, also exposed a sharp and important social division.